is Read Japanese Literature. My name is Allison Fincher. Read Japanese Literature is a podcast about Japanese fiction and some of its best works. All the works we discuss are available in translation, so you can read along if you want. You can find out more at readjapaneseliterature.com. Quick content warning: the end of the world isn't exactly a cheerful subject. We'll be briefly reviewing some of the upsetting events in Japanese history that influenced apocalyptic literature there. In particular, World War II, including the Battle of Okinawa, and several natural disasters, including the triple disasters of March 2011. This episode will mention death and rape, both historical and fictional, although it won't go into any graphic detail. Welcome back for the finale of our three-part series, The End of the World, Japanese Apocalypse. I've really enjoyed putting together this series for you. It's been a lot like starting the master's thesis I once dreamed of. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. If you haven't had the chance to listen to parts 1 and 2, I strongly suggest you start there. In part 1, we took a look at the origins of apocalyptic and dystopian fiction, especially English-language apocalyptic and dystopian fiction. In part 2, we began our story of Japanese apocalyptic and dystopian fiction. We looked at the evolution of the idea of an end of the world in Japan. We looked at stories that expressed fears about a world with nuclear weapons, written between 1945 and about 1970. And we looked at disillusionment in the 1970s and 1980s, leading to tales of violent cleansing of a corrupt and decultured world. Today, in part 3, we'll finish our story of Japanese apocalyptic and dystopian fiction, first with stories from the mid-90s and 20-aughts, then stories after the March 2011 triple disasters. And we'll end with a look at the life and work of author Yoko Tawada, who has written several apocalyptic stories, including one of the most important works of post-3/11 apocalyptic fiction available in English translation, The Emissary, also known as The Last Children of Tokyo. "1995 was a pretty awful year for Japan. It's really no wonder that 1995 marks a turn in apocalyptic literature. While the economic bubble had burst in 1989, Tanaka regards 1995 as the year in which Japan began to seriously suffer from that economic collapse. Certainly, it took the Japanese government and the Japanese public several years to accept that the problem was serious and was not just a blip. On January 17th, a 6.9 magnitude earthquake struck the southern part of Hyogo Prefecture in south-central Honshu, Japan's main island. In Japan, this earthquake is known as the Great Hanshin earthquake. Outside of Japan, we usually call it the Kobo earthquake, after the largest major city affected. The quake killed more than 6,000 people. 4,600 of them were in Kobe. It also injured 44,000 people and caused about 10 trillion yen in damage. Then, on March 20th, elite figures from a new religious movement called Aum Shinrikyo carried out an attack on the Tokyo Underground train system. Aum Shinrikyo was a new religious movement founded in the mid-1980s. I want to talk about new religious movements and Aum in an upcoming episode, so I'll leave it at that for now. But these elite members in Aum leadership carried packs of liquid traced with sarin onto the Tokyo Underground and killed 27 people and injured thousands. Combined, these three events shook Japan's confidence, perhaps even caused a crisis of identity, in a way that comes across in Japan's apocalyptic fiction for almost another 2 decades. The most obvious effects are in stories about dystopias or apocalypses brought about by new religious movements. Again, I'd like to take up these specific stories in an upcoming episode, but I should at least mention them now. Kenzaburo Oe's Somersault, published in 1999, is about leaders of a new religious movement attempting to refute and then reform their church when it develops a radical apocalyptic agenda. Haruki Murakami's Q-Teen 84 was published serially between 2009 and 2010. It's a novel about a woman who accidentally enters a different reality and then fights against a new religious group. I should mention that Murakami was somewhat fixated on 1995. He thought, probably still thinks, of 1995 as a real watershed year for Japan. He had been living abroad in a kind of self-imposed exile since the late 1980s. He returned to Japan after the Kobe earthquake and the Aum attack. He wrote a journalistic account of the Aum attack, published in English as Underground, the Tokyo gas attack and the Japanese psyche, which he published in 2 parts in Japan in 1997 and 1998. Actually, this is one of my favorites among Murakami's work. He also published a short story collection in response to the Kobe earthquake called After the Quake in 2000. Murakami ended part 1 of Underground with an essay in which he has this to say, quote, "The Aum phenomenon disturbs precisely because it is not someone else's affair. It shows us a distorted image of ourselves in a manner none of us could have foreseen. They are a mirror of us." The narrative that most Japanese embrace or imagine they share broke down. None of these common values provided the least effective in warding off the evil violence that erupted under us. In other words, Murakami's ultimate conclusion in Underground is that the perpetrators of the Aum attacks aren't an other, not a them, but an us. And Murakami wasn't alone in this thinking. The Aum attacks set off a kind of identity crisis in Japan that you can see in some of the apocalyptic and dystopian fiction of the next decade or so. Who am I really? What is my relationship to everyone else? Do I carry the apocalypse inside myself? Probably the most obvious example of these fears in English translation is 2010's Me by Tomoyuki Hoshino, translated by Charles DeWolf. In Me, a young man attempts an identity scam. In the end, he accidentally sets off a chain of events that results in a world of copies of himself, all competing with each other for limited resources, and things quickly turn violent. Motoko Tanaka adds sekai-kei stories to identity-oriented apocalyptic fiction of the 1990s. A caveat that the sekai-kei genre is a little controversial. I'm citing the work of a Japanese scholar, please don't shoot the messenger. Tanaka defines sekai-kei as work that, quote, features the combined theme of apocalyptic crisis and school romance, with situations in which the foreground, love between the always male protagonist and the heroine, is directly connected to the background, apocalyptic crisis and to the end of the world, without mediation of the middle ground, such as communities and societies. In other words, these are stories where we get a close look at a relationship between a male protagonist and his love interest, a female hero. The background is the end of the world, and we don't really see what else is going on. It's just the couple, the world's ending. We don't know much else. Neon Genesis Evangelion is probably the most popular Japanese apocalyptic story ever, both domestically and internationally. It isn't quite a sekai-kei story, at least according to Tanaka. Tanaka defines it this way because the male protagonist does not have his romantic wishes fulfilled. Its first incarnation was as an anime, which aired from 1995 to 1996. Let me just say that it is an odd show and kind of confusing. If you aren't a regular anime viewer, it's not where I would suggest you begin. Evangelion's basic premise is that 3 teenagers have to pilot giant biomechanical robots to fight destructive aliens called angels. These pilots all live in Tokyo 3, a city built after Tokyo was destroyed 15 years earlier in what's called the second impact, some kind of global catastrophe. Over the course of the show's 26 episodes, the show actually asks some quite sophisticated questions about what it means to be human. What's the relationship between a child and its parents? What kind of community does a human being actually need? Most Sekai stories are less philosophical and more escapist. They also have other features that are sort of markers of the time in which they were popular. The female leads in these stories often end up functioning as both romantic and/or sexual interests and mothers. Saikano, The Last Love Song on This Little Planet by Shin Takahashi, is a telling example. In that manga, the male lead is a high school student whose girlfriend is, for some reason, also a cyberbionic weapon defending Japan in some undefined apocalyptic war. She can't, in the end, save the world, but she can save the male lead by transforming into a spaceship and literally taking him into her own body. I suppose I sound skeptical. The premise is pretty over the top, but I actually rather enjoyed both the manga and the anime adaptation of that one. As I mentioned at the beginning of this section, Motoko Tanaka's analysis of apocalyptic Japanese fiction focuses on apocalyptic fiction aimed at men. Up until about 1980, perhaps, it makes a kind of sense to assume men are the target audience for apocalyptic stories. It's maybe about 1980 or so before men weren't just the assumed audience of many kinds of fiction, not only in Japan, but in the English-speaking world too. Women weren't broadly accepted as writers of speculative fiction either. By the 1990s, though, it seems short-sighted not to ask what apocalyptic stories women were reading and what apocalyptic stories women were writing. Or maybe it's just me. Tanaka's defense is that 1990s Sekai pop culture stories are many times more popular than almost any other kind of apocalyptic story, certainly than any literary apocalyptic stories. He cites psychiatrist and critic Tamaki Saito, who observes that best-selling novels in contemporary Japanese literature, quote, ably depict contemporary issues up to the year 1990, but, quote, there has been no work of traditional literature since then that can transcend the anime series Neon Genesis Evangelion in terms of critical attention, influence on other producers, and economic impact. Certainly, by influence and economic impact, he's absolutely right. I'm still not really sure it's a good idea to leave stories written by and/or targeted toward women out of your narrative, so I'm going to fill them in. Or at least to the extent I can. For my part, I'm limited by what has been translated. I can only think of two. You may remember from previous episodes that the 1990s and 2000s were a relative dry period for Japanese fiction that wasn't by Haruki Murakami. Fiction by Japanese women was rarely translated until the 2010s. So whatever apocalyptic stories from 1995 to 2011 exist, and I have to assume more do, the vast majority haven't been translated or written about in a forum I've been able to access. One exception I can think of is the manga series Full Metal Alchemist, written by a female mangaka, Hiromu Arakawa. It was published between 2001 and 2010. It's a sort of fantasy SF alternative history that basically reimagines World War I, except what if there were alchemy? The climax of that story features the antagonist attempting to trade the souls of the citizens of an entire nation for both immortality and omniscience. The other exception I can think of wasn't translated until 2019, but it was published in Japan in 2010. It's Hiroko Oyamada's The Factory. I love The Factory. It was another of the first Japanese novels I read. It's also Oyamada's English language debut. Extremely accessible, only 128 pages in David Boyd's English language translation. The Factory is almost an allegory about late-stage capitalism, although it stays on more of a surrealist level and never develops into simple symbolism. or even magical realism, Oyamada creates a sinister atmosphere that casts a pall over vaguely concerning aspects of everyday life in modern Japan, although the story could work as well in most modern countries. So when it comes to apocalyptic and dystopian stories by women from the 1990s and 20aughts, I guess the morals of the story are: 1, readers in translation only have access to what publishers give us. We need to acknowledge that there are parts of the story of a language's literature that we might just not know because it's not there for us to read. 2, it's important to translate not only women, but all kinds of underrepresented voices. There have been great strides in translating women, but what about Zainichi Koreans, Ryukyuans or Okinawans, LGBTQ Japanese, disabled Japanese? And 3, we should all be grateful for strong women's soft power, women in translation, and other advocacy for translating women, as well as for translators who have done that important work. On March 11, 2011, there was a 9.0 magnitude earthquake off the eastern coast of Japan. It's now known as Higashi Nihon Daishinsai, or the Great East Japan Earthquake. The Great East Japan Earthquake triggered a tsunami, a great wave, that may have reached heights of up to 133 feet. That's 40.5 meters. It rushed as far as 6 miles, 10 kilometers inland, that may have reached heights of up to 133 feet, 40.5 meters. It rushed as far inland as 6 miles, or 10 kilometers, and at speeds of up to 435 miles an hour, 700 kilometers an hour. It caused massive destruction along more than 250 miles, 400 kilometers, of Japan's eastern coast. Some coastal cities were wiped away in minutes. The earthquake and tsunami also disabled the reactor cooling systems at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. The afternoon of March 12th, one reactor exploded, creating problems with 2 others. Another exploded Monday. The next day, a third explosion released radiation at 10,000 times normal levels. More than 300,000 people were eventually evacuated because of the meltdowns. 3 months later, the company reported leaks might have spread into the Pacific Ocean. Collectively, people inside and outside of Japan refer to this series of events as Santen Ichi Ichi, or 311. The government released official death numbers around the 10th anniversary of 311 in 2021. It reported 19,759 deaths, 6,242 injuries, 2,553 missing, most of whom are presumed dead. Hundreds of thousands of people who evacuated the area still haven't returned home, and many never will. We did an entire episode about Fukushima fiction last year. I've just reviewed a little bit of the content, and I'll review a little bit more, but that episode goes into a good bit more detail. What's important for our narrative today is that 311 marked the beginning of a 4th era of Japanese apocalyptic fiction, just as Ted Goosen anticipated. The story of fiction that came out of 311 is really fascinating, in part because the literary community was actively writing as its way to participate in the recovery. There's a limited amount of Fukushima fiction translated from Japanese, especially fiction from beyond the first couple of years after the disaster. Of what's been translated, about half the standalone prose fiction titles are by women, and the majority of those are apocalyptic stories. Hiromi Kawakami's God Bless You 2011 is a short story that appears in the collection March Was Made of Yarn, edited by Elmer Luke and David Karashima. It was translated into English by Ted Goosen. God Bless You 2011 was one of the very first pieces of Fukushima fiction to emerge after 311, and it was also the piece we close read in our episode about Fukushima fiction. Kawakami wrote the short story Kami-sama, translated as God Bless You, in 1993. It's about a woman who befriends a bear who moves into the apartment next door. They go to a nice stream together, encounter an obnoxious little boy, have a picnic. Kawakami revisited that story immediately after 3/11. This time, there has been an accident, and the protagonist and the bear have to think about their exposure to radioactivity as part of their excursion. The stream is contaminated. There are no more children left anywhere in the area. Motoko Tanaka's survey ended in 2014. He didn't really have time to take up Fukushima fiction, so I'm relying on my own research and my own reading from here on out. What I've got access to is limited by what scholars are writing about and by what articles have made it to academic databases, as well as what's been translated. And what I have access to is also gendered because at the moment, what's being translated is pretty gendered. We're seeing Akutagawa winners and comfort reads about cats and coffee by men and women. We're seeing detective novels almost exclusively by men. And at the moment, it's mostly women writing the kinds of fiction that would include apocalyptic stories who are being translated. Japanese science fiction doesn't tend to sell well, so we aren't seeing much science fiction written by members of either gender. Just to be clear, I am not saying the situation is skewed in favor of women. My current count for 2024 shows that at the moment there are 18 fiction books by women being translated into English this year versus 25 by men. Anyway, I can tell you that children come up in a lot of post-3/11 apocalyptic and dystopian fiction. Again, children and maternity and child-rearing is not a new theme for apocalyptic fiction by women, but it does seem to take on maybe a new urgency. In God Bless You 2011, there are no children. In The Emissary, as we'll discuss, the children are all sick. I saw a fascinating talk at the Association of Asian Studies conference. The talk was by Professor Chiara Pavone at Bard College. She brought my attention to a number of works that haven't been translated from the later 2010s. It's bad form to give away someone's unpublished work from a conference talk, but I think just saying that I heard novels exist and mentioning I learned about it from an interesting professor is okay. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe rolled some of the 3/11 recovery efforts into his womanomics initiatives and initiatives to boost Japan's birth rate. For fiction writers, the result seems to have been a number of books, untranslated as of now, imagining that the Japanese government was forcing women to have children. Dr. Pavone offered examples. I didn't catch which of Sayaka Murata's novels she was including, but I believe it must have been Satsujin Shusan, something like Murderous Birth or The Birth Murder. There's a reasonable chance we will see this one translated, just a guess. The premise of Satsujin Shusan is that any person who gives birth to 10 children is granted the right to kill someone. Typical Murata, right? And by person, I'm not just being inclusive. Murata explicitly says in the novel that reproduction is through assisted fertilization. The government provides artificial uteri where necessary. So Murata's feminist dystopia is a good bit more complicated. What else would we expect from Sayaka Murata? If you don't know what I mean, check out our episode on Sayaka Murata and translating Japanese women. Let me close up our discussion of apocalyptic fiction from Japan with one more example of recent dystopian fiction, still obviously post-3/11, but maybe at a little bit more of a remove. This is Scattered All Over the Earth, also by Yoko Tawada. It was published in 2018. It has been translated into English by Margaret Mitsutani. It's a kind of Japanese post-apocalypse combined with a trans-apocalyptic story for the rest of us. The story never uses the word Japan or the word Japanese, but the land of sushi has ceased to exist. The story never really explains why, although it does give us hints, all of which are references to very real threats that face Japan, many of which we've discussed on this podcast. Urban sprawl led to the leveling of Japan's mountains. Okay, that one hasn't happened, but it's an expression of fear about destruction of Japan's environment. Sexual hormones became practically extinct. It seems that Japanese people could no longer distinguish between the virtual and real worlds. Laborers worked 80-hour shifts without sleeping. So we still have this post-3/11 sense of real immediacy in Japan's apocalypse. These things that are really happening or nearly happening right now have led to the end of Japan and scattered all over the earth. And not only have Japan's children disappeared, Japan itself is just gone. Japan has had its apocalypse, but it seems like the world is next. The protagonist is someone from the land of sushi who speaks the land of sushi's language. Even where she lives in Northern Europe, though, environmental poisons have caused salmon to grow to the size of whales. The apocalypse is happening everywhere else right now in the story. Scattered All Over the Earth is actually part of a trilogy. Part 2, Suggested in the Stars, comes out in English this fall of 2024, and Part 3 is supposed to come out in 2025. Yoko Tawada was born in 1960. That makes her 2 years younger than Hiromi Kawakami, the exact same age as Shun Meidoruma, and 4 years older than Banana Yoshimoto. Those are all other authors we've covered on this podcast. She's from Nakano, a special ward of Tokyo. You might have heard of Nakano from Hiromi Kawakami's novel, The Nakano Thrift Shop. Tawada's father was a nonfiction translator, and he eventually opened a bookshop selling academic books from abroad. Her undergraduate degree is from Waseda, one of Japan's most prestigious universities. In 1982, Tawada graduated with a degree in Russian literature. She wanted to move to the Soviet Union to study Russian literature, but that was no easy feat in 1982. Instead, she moved to Hamburg to work for one of her father's business partners in book distribution. Hamburg is a city in north-central Germany. It was part of West Germany before German reunification in 1990. It was only about 30 miles or 50 kilometers from the border with East Germany. By 1990, Tawada had earned a master's degree in contemporary German literature from Hamburg University. In 2000, she received her doctorate in German literature from the University of Zurich in Zurich, Switzerland, and in 2006, Tawada moved to Berlin, where she still lives. While she was earning her master's and PhD, Tawada was also writing fiction and poetry. In 1987, she published a bilingual German-Japanese collection of poetry. I'll spare you my attempt at the German title. The Japanese is Anata no iru tokoro dake nani mo nai, or Nothing Only Where You Are. In 1991, Tawada won Japan's Gunzo Prize for New Writers for her first novella, Kakato o Nakushite, Missing Heels. In 1993, Tawada won the Akutagawa Prize for her story Inu Muko Iri, available in Margaret Mitsutani's English translation under the title The Bridegroom Was a Dog. Tawada continued writing. In 1996, she won a special award for people writing in German for whom German was not their native language. So we have a Japanese writer who is a native Japanese speaker and writes literary Japanese, but also lives in Germany and writes award-winning German literary prose and poetry. Tawada is just a singularly impressive writer to me, and really a testament to how limited the world is for monolinguals or people like me who only dabble in other languages. She often writes the same stories in both Japanese and German using a process she calls continuous translation. For example, the novel we have access to in English as The Naked Eye was translated from the German by Susan Bernofsky, but she wrote that book in both languages simultaneously. She wrote the novel translated as Memoirs of a Polar Bear in Japanese first, and then translated it herself into German, her English language publisher, New Directions, suggested the English language translation should come from the Japanese version. The woman who ultimately translated the book into English, Susan Bernofsky, summarized Tawada's response this way, quote, "I have already moved the book from an Eastern language to a Western language for you. So if you translate to the German, it will be closer to my intention." In the same interview, Bernofsky clarifies that this approach, quote, "goes against all conventional wisdom in translation," but also that Tawada knows a lot about translation, so it's an interesting thought experiment. Bernofsky's translation, by the way, went on to win the very first Warwick Prize for Women in Translation. Tawada herself uses the term exophony for writing in a language that isn't one's mother tongue. People have been writing in non-native languages almost since the advent of writing. Certainly there was a long time that any self-respecting Latin-speaking Roman wrote in Greek if they wanted to be taken seriously, for example. The term exophony, though, is relatively new. Tawada has said of her use of exophony that it is both political and stylistic. By writing beautifully in both German and Japanese, as a Japanese writer, she could dismantle the ultra-nationalistic concept of beautiful Japanese language. And as we've discussed in earlier episodes, the Japanese language allows a great deal of ambiguity. Germanic languages like German and English don't. So writing the same thing in these two different languages is a significant stylistic challenge. And let me add that Tawada sometimes incorporates French, Russian, Chinese, Dutch, Afrikaans in her storytelling. And so you might not be surprised to learn that language becomes a major motif in some of her other work. Scattered All Over the Earth is especially notable. As I mentioned earlier, Scattered All Over the Earth is an apocalyptic novel. It's a novel about the land of sushi disappearing, leaving the people who speak its language adrift. One of the protagonists, Hiruko, doesn't know anyone else who speaks her language, so she concocts her own homemade language she calls Panska. It's mutually comprehensible across Scandinavia. A Danish linguistics student sees her talking about it on television, and he's compelled by the way Hiruko seems to be, quote, breathing in several grammars, melding them together inside her body, then exhaling them as sweet breath. The novel has one of my favorite scenes in a recently published book. One character asks Hiruko if she's a Buddhist. "No," Hiruko says, "I'm a linguist." "Is that a religion?" "Not really, but language can make people happy and shows them what's beyond death." Yoko Tawada is not only an author who has taken up apocalyptic storytelling, she also has made explicit comments about her own take on the history of apocalypse in the Japanese imagination. Tawada asserts that, quote, "the idea that the world has a beginning and an end is not well known in Japan." And we discussed that a little bit when we talked about the history of apocalyptic storytelling in Japan. In her telling, Catholic Jesuits imported the term, presumably in the 16th century when the first Catholic missionaries arrived in the country. You'll be a little bit familiar with that history, sort of, both from Read Japanese Literature's other episodes and if you've been watching Shogun. Earlier in this episode, I spoke about how the Japanese didn't rely on apocalyptic imagery to talk about the firebombing of Tokyo or the historical events of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. This is also true of the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake. My source is Yoko Tawada, or at least Tawada through an article by Catherine Maurer at the University of South Denmark. According to Maurer, when Tawada writes about apocalypses, she's interested in the ways more or less European theological idea about the end of the world traveled, crisscrossed oceans, was shipped over waters, and thus changed its meaning. I've already mentioned scattered all over the earth, but the rest of this episode is going to talk about two other apocalyptic stories by Yoko Tawada. First, a quick look at the short story, The Island of Eternal Life, and then a deeper dive into The Emissary. I don't know that Yoko Tawada thinks about it this way, but it's pretty clear to me that the 2012 short story, The Island of Eternal Life, is something like a first pass at some of the ideas she more fully developed in The Emissary. The Emissary was published 2 years later. You can find The Island of Eternal Life in March Was Made of Yarn, a collection of stories written in response to the 3/11 triple disasters. Like The Emissary, and virtually all of Tawada's work from Japanese, it was translated by Margaret Mitsutani. According to the story, in early 2013, the mass media started announcing the horrors of Fukushima are over. It would have been obvious in 2012 that that was a lie. As you might remember from our episode on Fukushima fiction, or as you might just know, even by the time of the so-called Recovery Olympics in 2021, the Japanese government was still hard-pressed to make the case that the horrors of Fukushima were now over. Again, according to the story, on the second anniversary of the triple disaster, anti-nuclear terrorists kidnapped the emperor and announced the emperor's wish is that all nuclear plants should be shut down immediately. The Prime Minister of Japan later disappeared, and by 2015, the government of Japan had been privatized. Japan has been closed and isolated ever since. The only information the narrator of the island has about Japan is from a book by a Portuguese writer who supposedly snuck into Japan. In English, the book is called The Strange Journey of the Grandson of Fernão Mendes Pinto, and the narrator thinks it reads like Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, a completely fictional work of satire. The very title is evocative for a number of reasons. The Portuguese did have a rather sneaky relationship with the isolated Japanese in the 17th century, and there really was a Fernão Mendes Pinto, although much too long ago to have a living grandson in the 2010s. Nevertheless, the strange journey of the grandson of Fernão Mendes Pinto goes on to describe a Japan that sounds a lot like what we'll encounter in The Emissary. The elderly can't die, children are sickly and need constant care. Language is leaving borrowed foreign loanwords behind. Fish and vegetables are too contaminated to eat. There's no electricity. It's almost like a return to the Edo period. And that, again, would be the period before the Meiji Restoration, before Americans and Europeans arrived in a way that significantly influenced everyday life in Japan. The story in The Emissary is much more developed than in The Island of Eternal Life. It would be. It's several times as long. But the story is also much more ambiguous. And just a reminder that The Emissary was published by Portobello and Granta Books in the UK as The Last Children of Tokyo. The title in Japanese comes from the name given to a Heian period Japanese ambassador to China. The title character is Mume, and he's an elementary schooler. Like all of his peers, he suffers from severe birth defects because of pollution in a post-apocalyptic Japan. His great-grandfather, Yoshiro, is really the protagonist of The Emissary, at least for most of the book. For the majority of Yoshiro's life, he has worked as a novelist. Now Yoshiro devotes most of his time to caring for Mume, and Mume requires a lot of care. Some disaster has devastated Japan. The disaster itself is never really clarified, although there are some hints linking it to 311. For example, Yoshiro recalls the weeks of living in temporary housing turning into years, almost like a throwback to Tohoku evacuees, some of whom are still living in temporary housing. On the other hand, in a turn of understated but gleeful irony, the marginal places of Japan today have become its most prosperous in the world of the Emissary. The economies of Tohoku, Hokkaido, and Okinawa are booming, while Tokyo is the place that's left to fall apart. So maybe 311 isn't the pivotal disaster. Mumei's teacher is pretty emphatic that no natural disaster is the problem. He insists to his class that, quote, Japan isn't the way it is now just because of the earthquakes and tsunami. If natural disasters were the only problem, we certainly would have recovered long before now. Regardless of the cause, the earth has become irreversibly contaminated, and it seems to be getting worse. In a few years' time, perhaps, they will no longer be able to leave the house. The disaster has also had significant and sometimes horrifying effects on human bodies. Old people never really age. There are young elderly and middle-aged elderly. People aren't identified as middle-aged elderly until they're well into their 90s. Yoshiro is about to turn 108. Young people, on the other hand, are debilitated by birth defects. We can only extrapolate from details that Tawada drops in, and most of them are about Mumei specifically. When Mumei goes to school, we can see that many of his classmates have similar limitations. Mumei's head is much too large for his slender, long neck, and his hairs are fine as silk threads. His teeth are so soft that Yoshiro has to soak bread in soy milk before he can eat. Kids' bodies just can't absorb the calcium they need. Mumei has bird-like legs that turn inward from the knee down. Japan has responded to whatever disaster or series of disasters caused all this by closing itself off from the world. The decision to isolate Japan was not made by popular consent, but it doesn't seem to have met with any real protest either. The Emissary also reflects Tawada's interest in language in ways that are extremely relevant to the plot. Some words have become too insensitive. When all of your children have birth defects, the word mutation becomes problematic. So the word mutation has been replaced by environmental adaptation. Orphans are now independent children. In an isolated country, foreign words are falling out of use. Purposeless running had once been referred to as jogging. It's not anymore. Tawada uses an emphasis on language for humor, too. I especially enjoy the way she plays with Japan's numerous national holidays. Because Japan's lifestyle and culture have changed in the Emissary, the names and purposes of holidays had to change too. Respect for the Aged Day, a holiday in celebration of people who are old and tired, has become encouragement for the Aged Day. Children's Day has become apologize to the Children's Day. Children can't play sports. Sports Day becomes Body Day. Young people can't work. Labor Day becomes Being Alive is Enough Day. It's notable that whatever the catastrophe was, Japan seems to have fallen apart so slowly that no one did anything in particular about it while it was happening. Certainly Yoshiro wasn't paying attention. Tawada seems to judge him for his lack of care, although she does it with a light touch. The middle third or so of the novel is the story of Yoshiro's relationship with his estranged wife Marika, again Mumei's great-grandmother. They fall in love at protest demonstrations, although the reader never really finds out what exactly they were protesting. We do know the crowds at these protests stretched for miles. The couple eventually marries. Yoshiro stays home, writing a novel about hikikomori. Marika, on the other hand, gets more and more involved in political causes. She does this in part as a mother of the daughter she and Yoshiro share. This would be the woman who becomes Mume's grandmother. There's a historical precedent for that in Japan. Some of the most successful nuclear activists in Japan were mothers' groups, for example. Who better to advocate for nuclear disarmament than the women whose children were at risk? Yoshiro's response to Marika's activism at the time was kind of sexist. He had, quote, always been wary of righteous social movements. Milky-smelling virtue contained resentment like sulfuric acid, directed at male writers too busy penning their gloomy, perverse novels to think of their homes and families. And if Yoshiro were to let down his guard, the acid would surely spill over to burn his hands. In other words, Yoshiro is afraid if he listens to Marika's advocacy, it will actually affect him. Marika leaves when their daughter grows up. Yoshiro's grandson floats in and out of his life, and Yoshiro is still too clueless about the world around him to be of much help to his grandson. It isn't really until Yoshiro is left with custody for his great-grandson that he looks around himself and discovers what Japan has become. And really, it's because he's obliged to take on a mother's role for Mume. I should mention that it's possible Tawada is trying to imply the series of events depicted in the Emissary has already begun. I worked out clues the story leaves behind. It's possible those protests were part of the student movement in the 60s, that Yoshiro's daughter was born as early as the 1990s, and that his grandson was born in the 2010s. Possible, but not necessary. An interesting thought experiment. The title of the book comes from a secret project that weaves its way through the narrative, the Emissary Association. The Emissary Association is looking for smart, selfless, personable, and visionary children to travel abroad. The goal is to make it possible to thoroughly research the state of Japanese children's health, yielding information that would prove useful if similar phenomena begin to appear in other countries. Again, there's this question, exactly how unique is what is happening in Japan? Exactly how much do the Japanese know about what is happening elsewhere? Mume, obviously, is a good candidate to become an emissary. I've given away a lot of the plot of The Emissary. It's the kind of book you don't really need to keep a secret to enjoy. But if you don't want me to spoil the ending, you should skip ahead about 2 minutes. The last 10 pages or so of The Emissary take place 7 years after the action of the rest of the book. Mume is 15 and prepared to leave Japan as an emissary. The section is a lovely interval. It even hints at a budding romance between Mume and a 15-year-old girl. She's going to be an emissary too. But abruptly, the action returns to the story's present. Mume is lying on the floor of his elementary school, and the 10-page interval was something like a dream. An optimistic reader might consider the dream a vision of the future. A pessimistic reader might think Mume is dying. Once again, the Japanese have made a plan to improve the situation that they will never put into action. And so Yoko Tawada's The Emissary is that kind of perfect apocalyptic story that provides an outlet for the audience's very reasonable fears about the future. A fear of isolation. Tawada has written several times about an Edo Renaissance since the beginning of Japan's economic crisis in the 1990s. In one talk, she noted, quote, "The longing for the Edo period as a time of isolation is based on the sentiment that the opening of Japan wrought havoc in the country." Perhaps the fear of Japanese isolation was even greater under the government of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. But consider that Japan virtually closed its borders entirely for almost 2 full years, in response to COVID-19. Is it possible Japan will cut itself off from the rest of the world entirely? Fear of environmental contamination. Post 3/11, fears of environmental contamination were at the forefront of everyone's minds. But it's not as though those fears have gone away. The soil near the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant is still contaminated, and there's still an exclusion zone. The Japanese government began intentionally releasing water from the plant into the Pacific Ocean just last year, 2023. And Fukushima fallout isn't even the greatest looming environmental disaster facing Japan or our planet. Not by a long shot. What will happen to our children in a contaminated world? Fear of a low birth rate. We've discussed Japan's low birth rate at length. After a small recovery, COVID-19 dealt a significant blow. 2023 saw the fewest births per woman in Japan ever recorded. The population shrank by more than 500,000 people last year. What would happen if children being born could not survive? Fear of an aging society. As we've also discussed, Japan has one of the most rapidly aging societies in the world. People already wonder who is going to care for the elderly there. What if the script were flipped and the elderly had to become the caretakers for the young? Fear for what some people think of as a dying language. The Japanese language is not dying, but we've discussed authors who worry about its future in the age of English. That's Mine Mizumura's phrase, not mine. Unlike many other languages, Japanese is barely spoken outside of Japan. What will happen to the Japanese language as the Japanese population shrinks? What if language itself ceases to hold its meaning? And fear of inaction. Yoshiro has lived through a societal collapse, but no one has done anything to stop it. What if all readers are doing the same thing even as they turn each page? So why read Japanese apocalyptic fiction? We're in a weird late-stage capitalist moment, still dealing with a pandemic that society seems set on ignoring, living with runaway wealth inequality that's only getting worse, watching climate change happen in real time, and watching most governments completely fail to act, dealing with new advances in technology that threaten not only people's livelihoods, but human creativity itself. Quite frankly, there are a lot of days it seems like we're living in a trans-apocalyptic moment. In some ways, it seems like the Japanese imagination has beaten the Western imagination to the punch. Japanese apocalyptic stories have anticipated some of the trends that English language apocalyptic literature is just catching up to. The kinds of apocalyptic stories English language writers didn't start writing en masse until the 2010s or so, work that portrays the apocalypse as the violent cleansing of a corrupt and decultured world, work that captures a real sense of hopelessness, was already coming out of Japan in the 1970s. Work that was dealing with crises of identity. Who are we as individuals? Who are we as a nation? Was already coming out of Japan in the 1990s and 20aughts. I guess I'm interested in Japanese apocalyptic fiction because it gives me a sense I'm looking ahead at what might be coming. And it grounds me with a sense of how another culture has coped with the same kinds of fears. Our focus text today was The Emissary by Yoko Tawada, translated into English by Margaret Mitsutani. As always, buy your books through our website or our bookshop.org page to support the podcast. The episode page always has a lot to offer, including a complete transcript. I hope you have a chance to check it out, whether you're book shopping or not. You can also support the podcast by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice, but the very best way to support Read Japanese Literature is through Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Remember that Patreon supporters get early access and bonus content for every episode. They also get weekly updates on the podcast and a newsletter with all new English language releases of Japanese literature. Finally, if this multi-part episode format hasn't worked for you, fear not. Read Japanese Literature will continue to have single-part episodes too. You can look forward to our next episode, which should be a one-part episode about Zainichi Korean literature, the stories of people of Korean descent living and writing in Japan. We'd love to hear from you about the podcast. There are so many ways to stay in touch. Through the website, Blue Sky at readjapaneselit.bsky.social, Instagram also at readjapaneselit, YouTube /@readjapaneseliterature. A big thank you to the Blue Sky community for helping me track down manga titles and manga translators. Thank you to Professor Chiara Pavone at Bard College for bringing some great post-2014 apocalyptic texts to my attention. Thank you to the Japanese literature groups on Goodreads and Facebook, and to the Japanese literature communities on Blue Sky and Twitter, with a special shout out to Forrest N. for early help brainstorming Japanese apocalyptic stories to include. Finally, thank you as always to producer Kime for today's music, kimemusic.com.